把这捡起来！把这捡起来！
The Dalai Lama has said that when he turns 90 years old, he will issue a letter to monks announcing whether he'll be reincarnated as a human, and if so, what the process will be. Now, that birthday is set to come next year, which may be one reason that China is signaling it is increasingly nervous about what happens next.
Communist parties watch. That's what's happening. CCP is keeping close tabs on the Tibetan celebrations in Tibet.
A new report says that China has set up torture camps in Tibet. High security detention facilities that are being used to hammer Tibet's unique identity and alter the Tibetan way of life.
How will Tibetans around the world respond if China picks its own Dalai Lama?
It'll be unpredictable. There might be unrest.
No tactics seem too extreme in the effort to hinder China's rise. Ranging from crippling economic sanctions to carefully orchestrated media narratives, a coordinated campaign is unfolding. The most concerning element, however, is the deliberate manufacturing of consent for conflict, a dangerous game of manipulation designed to justify confrontation. By distorting facts and fueling fear, the West aims to galvanize public opinion and mobilize allies, pushing the world dangerously closer to a new era of geopolitical tension.
I was born in Tibet before the Chinese invasion of Tibet. Unfortunately, 1.2 million Tibetans have died since, and we have been made refugees. Tibet, after 74 years of Chinese rule, is still under lockdown. No journalists, no individual tourists, even Tibetans are not allowed to see their families. What is China afraid of to keep Tibet in such a tight control and Tibetans in such an inhuman existence in our own country?
This is Tibet, a land of spiritual beauty framed by the snow-capped Himalayas, where ancient monasteries echo with chants of resilience. A region where few could survive due to its high altitude and low oxygen. Tibet is not for the weak. It is a place of endurance, both physical and spiritual. Since 1965, Tibet has been an autonomous region of China, integrated into the People's Republic. This period, from the mid-19th century to the early 20th century, saw China suffer a series of defeats, foreign invasions, and unequal treaties, resulting in losses of territory and sovereignty. Key countries involved in this period of humiliation include Britain, Japan, the United States, France, and Germany. Tibet is a pivotal crossroads in geopolitics, where its future sparks global debates on sovereignty and human rights. Led by the US, Western nations have leveraged Tibet as a crucial element in their broader strategy to contain China.
His Holiness the Dalai Lama, with his message of knowledge and tradition and compassion and purity of soul and love, he will live a long time and his legacy will live forever. But to you, President of China, you'll be gone and nobody will give you credit for anything.
Nancy Pelosi's statement, Dalai Lama's legacy will live on and she will be gone, is undiplomatic and irresponsible. Addressing China's internal matters with such casual dismissal undermines constructive dialogue and mutual respect in international relations. This is the real story of China and Tibet, from the perspective of a Han Chinese and a native Tibetan.
Hello, welcome to Tibet.
In the early 600s, the Tibetan Empire emerged as a formidable power under the leadership of Songtsen Gampo, who united warring tribes and established Lhasa as the capital. He marries Princess Wencheng of China, marking a strategic alliance with the Tang dynasty. The Tang dynasty, however, was embroiled in the An Lushan Rebellion, a devastating uprising that weakened the empire. Taking advantage of this turmoil in 763 CE, Tibetan forces captured Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, the Tang capital. At its peak, the Tibetan Empire controlled vast territories including parts of Central Asia, northern India, Nepal, and China's western regions. In 842, the assassination of Emperor Langdharma marked the end of Tibet's imperial unity. The once mighty empire fragmented into smaller regions with local lords and Buddhist monastic orders filling the power vacuum. Despite the political fragmentation, Tibetan Buddhism flourished. Monastic institutions became the custodians of Tibetan traditions, laying the groundwork for future theocratic governance. Beginning in 1211, Genghis Khan's ferocious Mongol armies surged across the Great Wall, tearing through China with unmatched brutality. His campaigns devastated the Jin dynasty, capturing Beijing in 1215 and paved the way for a century of Mongol rule. The cost was catastrophic. Half of China's population was slaughtered in their wake, entire cities reduced to ashes. His son, Ogadai Khan, crushed northern China, while his grandson, Kublai Khan, toppled the southern Song dynasty in 1279 to establish the Yuan dynasty. Kublai became the first non-Han ruler of a unified China. Under Kublai Khan, Tibet became a vital pawn in the Yuan Empire, ruled through lamas bound by a patron-priest pact. With the fall of the Yuan dynasty in 1368, the Ming dynasty succeeded in expelling the Mongols from China. However, Tibet's relationship with the Ming remained ambiguous. Although under Chinese suzerainty, Tibet operated with significant independence, maintaining its distinct governance and culture. During the 15th and 16th centuries, the Gelugpa school of Tibetan Buddhism rose to power, leading to the establishment of the Dalai Lama lineage. By the 17th century, the 5th Dalai Lama consolidated both spiritual and political power, creating a theocratic system. This led to the system often described as serfdom or feudalism, where a significant portion of the population, especially peasants and rural workers, was subjected to the control of the clergy or aristocratic lords. The system was oppressive, with many Tibetans living under conditions of servitude and exploitation. After a series of internal Tibetan conflicts and external threats from the Dzungar Khanate, Qing forces intervened in the 1720s. The Qing appointed ambans, imperial residents to Lhasa, the capital, as a means of maintaining control over Tibet. These ambans were high-ranking officials sent by the Qing government to oversee Tibetan affairs and ensure loyalty to the Chinese Empire. Despite this, Tibet maintained considerable autonomy, preserving its religious and cultural traditions. Throughout the 18th century, Tibet navigated a delicate balance of partial independence under Qing protection. A semi-sovereign region whose sovereignty was acknowledged but constrained. In 1904, British forces led by Colonel Francis Younghusband invaded Tibet, citing concerns over Russian influence in the region. The Tibetans were massacred and forced to submit to Western imperialism. Following the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, Tibet took the opportunity to demand its independence. So in 1913, the 13th Dalai Lama declared Tibet a sovereign nation. However, this declaration was met with limited international recognition, leaving Tibet in a state of de facto independence, but lacking formal acknowledgement on the world stage. The Chinese Civil War erupted in 1927, pitting the Communist Party of China, CPC, against the ruling nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek. The conflict, fueled by ideological divisions and foreign interference, devastated the nation for over 2 decades. Despite early nationalist victories, the communists led by Mao Zedong employed guerrilla warfare and garnered support from the rural populace, gradually gaining the upper hand. The US, driven by its fear of communism, threw its weight behind Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government. Through the CIA, vast sums of money, military supplies and strategic training flowed into the nationalist effort. Yet despite this backing, corruption and a disconnect from China's farmers and peasants crippled the nationalists. In 1949, the nationalist forces were decisively defeated, fleeing to Taiwan, with vast reserves of gold, art, and national treasures, establishing a government in exile. Undeterred, the CIA continued covert operations attempting to destabilize Mao's regime, but the People's Republic of China emerged unbroken. During this period, Tibet operated under theocratic rule, led by the Dalai Lama, defined by a rigid feudal hierarchy deeply entrenched in religious authority. The monastic institutions wielded unparalleled economic power, controlling vast tracts of land and exerting influence over the lives of the people. A significant portion of the population was comprised of monks whose labor sustained the wealth and dominance of the monasteries. After the victory of the People's Liberation Army in mainland China, Mao Zedong sought to unify all 56 ethnic groups. These groups include the Han Chinese, who make up about 92% of the population, and 55 ethnic minorities, including Tibetans, each with distinct languages and traditions. In October 1950, the People's Liberation Army entered Tibet to capture the border city of Chamdo. Although Tibet was formally and legally internationally recognized as part of China, the US and allies nervously watched Chairman Mao unite a country they perceived as a threat under communist rule. The CIA reached out to the Tibetan leader, the Dalai Lama, who was only 15 years old at the time, to resist the Chinese communists in exchange for money. In order to create a Chinese invasion crisis, the young Dalai Lama ought to flee to either India, Sri Lanka, or Thailand, where a significant number of Buddhists reside. Luckily, the young ruler saw through the West's treacheries and refused to sacrifice his people and country for Western imperialist ambitions in Asia. The signing of the 17-Point Agreement in 1951 formalized Tibet's incorporation into the People's Republic of China. Everything went well for a while. The Dalai Lama visited China and was impressed by the reforms and modernization that were taking place. Under the signed agreement, Tibet was recognized as part of China under the leadership of the Chinese government. Tibetan local government retained authority, and religious practices were to be respected. Existing socio-economic structures were to remain unchanged. The preservation of Tibetan language, culture, and institutions was also guaranteed. The People's Liberation Army was allowed entry into Tibet for defense purposes. Here is what you need to know. Chairman Mao was a visionary, a man who opposed any institutions, including religions that exploit the poor. Land reform in Tibet under Chinese communist policies targeted the traditional feudal hierarchy, redistributing land from religious and aristocratic elites to peasants and serfs. Monasteries and noble families viewed as oppressors lost their land and economic power, aligning with communist ideals of class struggle and equality. While some peasants benefited, these reforms dismantled Tibet's traditional socio-religious structure, weakening monastic institutions. China was finally united under the communist flag. In 1954, the 14th Dalai Lama Tenzin Gyatso traveled to Beijing, where he met with Mao Zedong and other Chinese leaders. That same year, Mao appointed him vice chairman of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. This high-ranking political position symbolized Tibet's formal integration into the People's Republic of China. However, the CIA did not relent. The Americans maintained contact with Gyalo Thondup, the Dalai Lama's brother, who was deeply dissatisfied with Chairman Mao's reforms in Tibet. The rugged peaks of Tibet became a silent battleground in the global struggle between communism and the West. Driven by the desire to weaken Mao Zedong's grip on China, the CIA launched one of its most covert and daring operations. Gyalo Thondup collaborated with the CIA to train Tibetan resistance fighters at Camp Hale in Colorado, the clandestine hub of the Tibetan insurgency. Between 1950 and 1974, Tibetan fighters were secretly airlifted to remote training grounds where they were forged into guerrilla warriors. Once hardened, these men parachuted from CIA aircraft over Nepal into Tibet. Their mission was clear: ignite resistance, bleed the communists, and reclaim the theocratic autocracy. By 1959, the insurgency erupted into a full-scale uprising. Lhasa burned in revolt. In the chaos, over 2,000 Chinese communist soldiers were killed by Tibetan guerrillas. Yet despite their ferocity, the rebellion was brutally crushed by the People's Liberation Army. For the CIA, it was a shadow victory, one that stirred the mountains but failed to topple the dragon. For Tibet, it was a tragic gamble paid in blood. The Dalai Lama fled across the Himalayas into India. Seizing the moment, the United States intensified its Cold War strategy, establishing unofficial Tibetan embassies in New York and Geneva to legitimize the Dalai Lama's government in exile. However, President Nixon's historic rapprochement with Mao in the 1970s forced the US to abandon Tibet. The CIA support ceased. Tibetan fighters were crushed in Nepal, and Washington's gambit to fracture China ultimately failed. Tibet, once mired in poverty and isolation, has undergone a dramatic transformation as an autonomous region of China. Through the Chinese government's poverty alleviation programs, Tibetans have been lifted from hardship into a new era of prosperity. Decades ago, the average life expectancy in Tibet was a mere 36 years, hindered by extreme altitude, a harsh climate, and limited health care. Today, it has soared to over 75 years, thanks to free healthcare and modern medical facilities that overcome even the region's thin air and rugged environment. Equally remarkable is the near eradication of illiteracy. The region's comprehensive free education system from preschool to higher education has empowered generations, blending modern knowledge with the preservation of Tibetan heritage. Cities across the region such as Lhasa and Shigatse now display beautiful traditional architecture and are well known for their cleanliness and modern development. In a surprising act of national solidarity, several provinces and municipalities in mainland China provide economic assistance to the Tibet Autonomous Region through a program known as pairing assistance. For example, Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangdong have been actively involved in providing financial aid, infrastructure development, and human resources to Tibet. This support is part of China's broader strategy to balance regional development and boost economic growth. As a result, Tibetan culture is thriving. While security measures exist to safeguard national stability, they are modest. Western powers, frustrated by China's rise beyond their influence, resort to slander and misinformation. Tourists are welcomed in Tibet, though filming inside holy temples is restricted out of respect for Tibetan beliefs. Would you consider visiting Tibet to see the truth for yourself? Let us know in the comments below.